So to start this all off, user needs is the first thing that gets talked about in the design control space. So what does that mean? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically you want to understand who's using the device and what they need. And so, you can get at this information in a variety of ways. One of the most straightforward ways is to think about who your users are and recognize that that's probably going to be more than one person. While it may be primarily one physician or one surgeon that is doing the heavy lifting when it comes to using your device, you still want to count a patient as a user. Or your patient may be a user if you're designing something that's supposed to have a patient interface that they can manage. Glucose monitors would be a good example of that. And you want to basically plan to sit down and talk to users and ask them questions like these, but not limited to these, around what they think about use, and gather that information into some kind of a matrix so that you can use it to try to help support understanding what your users need. In addition, the other thing in this space is that your users will tell you what they know. But in many times, it's hard to always imagine, especially if you're creating something in the future, all of the things that they might need. They'll tell you the best of what they know today. And so the other thing that you need to try to do is observe other potential user needs through other sources. You could look to current clinical protocols intended to treat patients that have the same issue today. You could create flowcharts of that and try to identify other broader functional needs. You start thinking about what is the clinical risk if there isn't a treatment? And what about the technology that I'm making? Is that going to potentially present more risks at a high level? Like, could it be more dangerous to a patient? And if it is, would that danger be worth it? Would there be a benefit in the end that would make it worth it? So at a high level, you start thinking about those elements as well to try to identify, a good example would be anything that has any kind of a method of cutting into somebody. Does it always have to have that? Is that necessarily a real need for you to be able to perform the function that you need? Because there could be risks associated with cutting something. You usually start also doing some level of concept drawings at this point to try to imagine like what you're doing. You might make some prototypes, but even in doing that, you start understanding different aspects of what something needs to do. And all this information comes at you in a way that's kind of iterative, I would say. You have conversations, you try things out, you learn things, you're going to learn things from those conversations, bring it back, and you eventually end up with a starting point that you would say, okay, this is a good starting point to say that we've captured some user needs, and now we have enough information to go to the next step of determining our design inputs. But before we do that, I want to start just kind of going through a little bit more what I mean by a user need versus a design input. And this is an issue that I think I've definitely struggled with personally, and I've seen other people struggle with. So I've pulled an example device of the balloon catheter here. So at a high level, user needs should be focused on more qualitative things. They're going to need this catheter to be able to navigate they have to be able to navigate it to wherever they're treating it. They have to be able to inflate the balloon once they get there, so that has to be, probably not too difficult for them to do. You're going to want everything to collapse back down so you can pull it back out of the patient without hurting the patient. And you're also going to want to have certain things like it has to fit into a certain reimbursement windows. Maybe you have an idea of a cost target, but it's probably more of a relative cost. There typically aren't, hard ceilings that you'd have to face that are specific to devices because you're using them in procedures. So there might be give and take. If your device can make the procedure shorter, then it might be worth more than what they might pay for a device today. So understanding how you might fit within those things would be more the user need. Things that aren't user needs would be, well, the product has to be 120 centimeters. That length may be the length that you need the catheter to be to navigate to your treatment area, but it's potentially limiting to simply say, well, right out the gate, we know this product has to be 120 centimeters. There could be other ways you could navigate to your treatment area There could be other ways that you could enter in that you might need to develop as a part of your design, that if you just focused on saying, well, we're just going to make it 120 centimeters without scrutinizing the why and what's the functional need for that 120, that you might miss. In addition, things like material choices. The balloon must be made from polyurethane. You need to kind of get back to why. Is that because we're looking for material that inflates easily? You do have biocompatibility considerations we'll talk about later. Is that what's driving that choice? Or when you hear a user say something like that, it's worth asking why. Why do you think it needs to be made from polyurethane? What's telling you that? Is that because comparable products are made from that material? Just try to understand more around why a user might be perceiving that that's a need. Tensile strengths as well as specific costs. What I'm trying to get at is that the things on the right are a little bit more specific to things that you would eventually determine are your design inputs based on an analysis of the range of solutions that could address your user needs. So your design inputs will be translations, and maybe those are the appropriate translations, but you want to recognize that they're translations, and they're not that the user is saying that they need any of those things. Okay? So as we shift into thinking about how do you start identifying design inputs, definitely you start with those captured user needs. But then you're also going to start bringing in a lot more experimental data, a lot more prototyping work if you started it, or consideration and evaluation of similar devices. Some of the other elements you might get from user needs would be this catheter needs to fit within this tubing. So that compatibility right there is going to be another input that you're going to bring into your design process. And as well, you're going to need to start considering some of those regulatory needs that we started talking about. What kind of product would this be? Where might they want to regulate it? And what kinds of standards or requirements might I need to meet? For instance, if your product has a Lure lock on it, there are a ton of ISO standards related to what kind of Lure lock. It's that more recently is connected to what function because of issues in the past with the fact that Lure locks used to be universal, so you could accidentally connect somebody's feeding tube to a blood catheter. So now you actually are thinking about, okay, what function do I need? What size Lure lock? What are the applicable standards that I'm going to need to start thinking about so that I'm designing prototypes that would respond to the clinical use need appropriately. So you consider all of those elements. As you go, you're going to learn information that's going to also make you ask new questions of your users. Would your user feel comfortable turning the product to the right? Or do they just want to have something go straight? So there's a new refinement element that will come into this and start to create a loop that eventually will lead you to some documented design inputs, some requirements that you've defined that help you understand what the product needs to be to address the user needs. So we'll go to the liquid embolic example here to think about the kinds of things that end up being captured and defined as design inputs. And you're really thinking about a broad range of requirements that go a little bit beyond just the actual device itself and the functions it needs to have. So you've got the typical design elements you might expect, some levels of dimensions, characterizations, in this case, how quickly is this material setting, or what are the material components in there? What's the end result of that embolic once it's been formed? What are some of the key viscosities that you'd want to have in the syringe? How are you storing the syringe? So we start to then bridge into things related to the overall life of the product, because it's not like the product just materializes one day magically into the user's hands. It has to get to them somehow. So how is it getting there? How long do you expect to be storing it? What conditions does it need to be stored under? What packaging should it be in so that it gets to the user in the concentration that you need it? How long do you think that whole thing could sit on a shelf? And that actually has more to do with, in many cases, how long are you willing to test it? And there's a range of ways that you can validate that. There are Arrhenius accelerated methods are used in most cases, but there's other models that have been being investigated simply because heating things does not always simulate aging, but it's definitely used often. Some of the regulatory standards compliance elements we talked about before. If your device is like something like a cardiac balloon catheter, there's a lot of expectations and guidance that the FDA and that ISO have put down related to kinds of functional tests that they would expect to see be performed. You're going to need to build those in and make sure that what you're designing considers those elements in addition to what your user needs.